The conference room on the 42nd floor went silent the moment Ryan Cole slid the contract back across the table. $10 billion. The number sat there between them like a fact nobody wanted to touch. Gerald Whitmore, patriarch of the most powerful family on Wall Street, studied Ryan the way a man studies something he cannot quite categorize. Then he asked, low and deliberate, "Do you understand what you just walked away from?" Ryan met his eyes without blinking. "No," he said. "I understand what I just kept." The room did not know what to do with that. The story did not begin in that conference room on the 42nd floor. It began years earlier in a rented office above a laundromat on a street in Brooklyn, where the air always smelled faintly of detergent, and the radiator knocked all winter like it had something urgent to say. Ryan Cole had signed the lease on a Tuesday afternoon, paid 3 months up front in cash he had been saving for 2 years, and sat alone at a folding table with a laptop and a legal pad and the particular kind of quiet that only exists when a person has committed to something they cannot yet fully see. He was 31 then. He had spent the years before that working customer support for a mid-sized software company in New Jersey, answering tickets, logging complaints, learning every way a system could fail from the inside out. It was not glamorous work. Nobody wrote profiles about it. But Ryan paid attention in a way most people in that building did not, and what he saw month after month was how much companies were hemorrhaging because their data was fragmented, misread, or simply ignored. The problem was not a lack of information. The problem was that nobody had built the right architecture to make it useful in real time, so he built it himself. That was the short version of the story, the one that got repeated in investor decks. Later, the longer version involved a lot of nights where the ceiling of that Brooklyn office was the last thing he saw before falling asleep at his desk, a lot of cold coffee, a lot of calls that went unreturned, and a period of roughly 8 months where he was not entirely certain the company would survive the next quarter. But Veyron Data Systems did survive, and then it did more than survive. It grew in the way that companies grow when the product is genuinely solving something real, not in a straight line, but steadily contract by contract, client by client, until the name meant something in rooms Ryan had not yet been invited into. By the time he was in his mid-30s, Veyron had offices in 3 cities, contracts with financial institutions and logistics companies, and 2 federal agencies that Ryan was not permitted to discuss publicly. He ran it the way he had built it, with discipline, with an obsessive attention to the details that other executives delegated away, and with a directness that some people found refreshing and others found inconvenient. He did not play golf. He did not do charity dinners. He was not particularly interested in being seen. He was interested in whether the product worked and whether the people who depended on it were taken care of. His personal life was quieter than his professional one, and he preferred it that way. The marriage had ended several years before, with the kind of mutual exhaustion that comes when 2 people have grown in directions that no longer intersect. He lived alone in a Manhattan apartment that was larger than the Brooklyn office, but not by much in terms of how much of it he actually used. Most evenings, he was at his desk until late, the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the way that Manhattan is always visible, glittering and indifferent, going about its business, regardless of what any individual person inside it happens to be working through. That was the life he had built, not by inheritance, not by connection, by the particular kind of stubbornness that refuses to mistake discomfort for impossibility. The Whitmore family did not call him directly. That was the first signal, though Ryan did not read it as one at the time. The outreach came through an intermediary, a corporate attorney named Douglas Fitch, who had the smooth, practiced manner of someone whose entire career had been spent managing the distance between powerful people and the things they wanted. Fitch explained that the Whitmore family was interested in a strategic acquisition. He used the phrase "significant interest" 4 times in a single conversation, which Ryan noted without comment. He said he would review whatever proposal they wanted to send. Fitch said they preferred to begin with a conversation. Ryan agreed to the meeting. The Whitmore name was not something that required explanation in certain circles. The family had been a presence in American finance for 3 generations. Not the loudest name, but one of the most durable. Gerald Whitmore had inherited a substantial portfolio from his father and spent 40 years expanding it with the methodical aggression of someone who understood that real power is rarely theatrical. His 2 sons, Marcus and Drew, had been positioned at different nodes of the family's financial network, in the way that dynasties position their heirs, not so much as individuals with particular strengths, but as extensions of a single continuous strategy. They moved through New York the way old money always moves without urgency, because urgency implies doubt. The first meeting was held in the Whitmore family's offices, not a neutral location, a choice Ryan registered without making anything of it. The room had the kind of furnishings that are selected not for comfort, but for the specific message they send about who belongs there and who is a visitor. Gerald sat at the head of the table. Marcus and Drew sat flanking him. Fitch was present. There were 2 other men whose function Ryan never quite determined. The $10 billion figure came out within the first 20 minutes, delivered with the calm of people who say large numbers the way others say the weather. Ryan listened. He asked questions. He did not perform enthusiasm, and he did not perform reluctance. He said he would need time to review and consider which was true, and the meeting ended with handshakes and the understanding that further conversations would follow. What followed were 3 more meetings spread over 5 weeks, and it was in those meetings gradually, the way water finds the low points in a surface, that Ryan began to understand what he was actually being asked to accept. The comments started small. Gerald Whitmore made a remark in the second meeting about Ryan's background, framed as admiration delivered with the slight tilt of the head that men use when they want to say something condescending while preserving the option to deny it. He said it was remarkable what Ryan had built given where he had started. He said that, as if starting in a Brooklyn office above a laundromat was a defect that had been successfully overcome, rather than simply a beginning. Ryan let it go. People said things like that. It did not necessarily mean anything beyond carelessness. By the third meeting, the carelessness was harder to dismiss. Marcus Whitmore had done his research, or rather, had someone do it for him, and he referenced Ryan's years in customer support in New Jersey in a way that was technically informational, but functionally meant as diminishment. He said something about Ryan's unconventional path and non-traditional background, in a tone that made it clear those phrases were euphemisms. Drew Whitmore mentioned twice, without apparent reason, that the firms they typically partnered with came from established institutional networks, a phrase that meant something specific to everyone in the room and was not meant kindly. Ryan said nothing to any of it. He took notes. He watched. The proposal they eventually laid out was structured around a concept they called legacy positioning. Ryan would retain the title of founder. His name would remain on the company. He would have a seat on the board, an advisory seat, non-voting. The actual operational authority would transfer to a CEO of the Whitmore families, choosing a figure Ryan had not met and was not invited to have significant input on selecting. Ryan would receive $10 billion in exchange for this arrangement. The word partnership appeared repeatedly in their language. The word control appeared nowhere. Fitch presented this as though it were generous. Marcus Whitmore smiled the way people smile when they expect the other party to be grateful. Gerald sat at the head of the table and said nothing because he was the kind of man who understood that silence in the right moment functions as pressure. Ryan looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked at Gerald. He said he needed time to think. Gerald said in the tone of a man reminding someone of the obvious that an offer of this size did not stay open indefinitely. Ryan said he understood. He picked up his copy of the document and left. He did not go back to the office. He took the elevator down to the street and walked. Not with a destination, just walked down through Midtown with the particular mid-afternoon crowd moving around him, the city doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous. He walked until the noise of it settled into something that felt less like pressure, and then he found a place to sit and thought about what had just happened in that room. The $10 billion was real. That was not a small thing to set aside. What that number represented in terms of Veyron's reach, its ability to scale its capacity to do the work it was built to do on a global level, Ryan understood all of it clearly. He had not built this company to keep it small. He had built it because he believed in what it could become. And $10 billion was not an obstacle to that vision. In certain ways, it was the door. But the door they were offering him opened into a room where he did not have a voice. He would have a title and a nameplate and a carefully managed public identity as the founder of a company that other people would now actually run. He would be in the language they had used without quite using it a face. A respectable, useful face, attached to a name that gave the acquisition a better story for the press. The kind of arrangement where the person whose work made the whole thing possible is positioned tastefully to one side. He thought about the comment Marcus had made about customer support in New Jersey. He thought about the phrase, unconventional path. He thought about the way Gerald had sat at the head of the table in the second meeting and said it was remarkable what Ryan had accomplished, and the precise quality of condescension that word had carried, not malicious, just absolute. The kind of condescension that doesn't know it is condescension because it has never had to question itself. Ryan sat with all of that for a long time. He went home to his apartment. The city was visible through the windows, the way it always was. Steady, luminous, going about its enormous, indifferent business. He stood at the glass for a while, and then he sat at his desk, and he looked at the document again, without reading it. He thought about everything he had given to build what Veyron was. Not in the way people dramatize sacrifice, not as suffering, not as heroism, but plainly. The years, the decisions, the weight of it, the specific cost of being responsible for something that other people depend on, and carrying that responsibility without a safety net, without a family name that functions as a floor beneath you if you fall. He thought about what it would mean to hand the real substance of that over to people who had in 5 weeks of meetings made it quietly but consistently clear that they did not consider him their equal. People who saw $10 billion as a number large enough to purchase his acquiescence on that point. He stayed at the desk until the city outside went from dark to the particular gray that comes before dawn. He did not sleep. He was not anxious exactly. He was thinking with a clarity that only comes when a person has finally stopped arguing with themselves and accepted what they already know. By morning, he knew what he was going to do. He called Fitch and told him he would like one more meeting. Fitch, reading this as the preamble to final negotiation, arranged it quickly. The conference room on the 42nd floor again. Gerald at the head. Marcus and Drew on either side. The same furniture sending the same message about who belongs in rooms like this. Ryan sat down. He did not open his copy of the document. He did not bring a lawyer or a counter-proposal. He looked at Gerald Whitmore across the table, and he said one word. No. Gerald's expression did not change immediately. The word took a moment to land the way large, simple things sometimes require a second to register. Marcus straightened slightly. Drew looked at his hands. Fitch made a sound that was not quite a word. Gerald looked at Ryan with the careful attention of a man encountering something he had not prepared for. Then he asked, low and deliberate, whether Ryan understood what he was walking away from. He said the number. He said it clearly, as though Ryan might have forgotten it. $10 billion. Ryan met his eyes without blinking. He said what he said in that conference room, the line that would later get repeated in ways he never intended and could not control. He said he was not walking away from anything. He said he understood what he was keeping. Then he stood up, pushed his chair back, and left the room. In the elevator on the way down, he stood with his hands in his pockets and watched the floor numbers descend. He felt something that was not relief exactly, and not fear. It was closer to the feeling of having put something down that you have been carrying for a long time, not because the weight has stopped being real, but because you have finally decided it is not yours to carry anymore. He walked out of the building into the morning, and the city received him exactly as it always had, without ceremony, without opinion, without the slightest acknowledgement that something had just changed. That was fine. Ryan Cole had never needed the city to tell him where he stood. He had always figured that out for himself. The story broke on a Thursday morning in late March. By Friday, it had become something else entirely. The initial reporting was straightforward enough. A financial publication ran a piece on the collapsed Whitmore acquisition factual, and dry, the kind of item that gets 1,200 words and a sidebar. But the framing was already there in the headline, already doing its work before the first sentence. A founder had walked away from $10 billion. The implicit question the piece kept returning to, without ever quite asking it directly, was whether Ryan Cole had made a rational business decision, or whether pride had disguised itself as principle and cost everyone around him accordingly. By the following week, that implicit question had become an explicit one across half a dozen financial outlets. The story had found its shape, the shape that the financial press prefers, because it is clean and it carries moral weight, and it can be repeated without losing anything in translation. A man of ordinary origins had been offered an extraordinary sum. He had refused it. The most charitable interpretation was that he had miscalculated. The less charitable interpretation, which several columnists pursued with obvious relish, was that he had let ego make a decision that should have been made by reason. Ryan read some of it and stopped reading the rest. He had spent enough time in business to understand that the press does not cover what actually happened. It covers the version of what happened that fits the available narrative, and the available narrative here was irresistible, the kind that writes itself. What was harder to set aside than the press coverage was what followed it inside the company. 2 senior vice presidents submitted their resignations within 3 weeks of each other, both citing strategic uncertainty in their letters, which was a professional way of saying they had run the numbers and concluded that the ship was in trouble. Ryan accepted the resignations without trying to argue them out of it. He understood the calculus. These were people with options, people whose careers did not depend on Veyron specifically, and they had made the calculation that a company whose founder had just declined $10 billion from the most connected family on Wall Street was a company whose next chapter was unclear. They were not wrong to think that. They were just wrong about what the next chapter would look like. The shareholders were more complicated. Ryan spent 3 weeks in a sequence of calls and meetings with the major stakeholders, delivering the same core argument in different configurations, that Veyron's value had not changed, that the Whitmore offer had not been declined out of recklessness, that the company's fundamentals were intact, and its pipeline was strong. Some of them believed him. Some of them believed him, and were still worried, which is a different thing. A few made it clear, with varying degrees of directness, that they thought he had made a significant error, and that they expected him to demonstrate in concrete terms that the error was survivable. At the same time, 2 enterprise clients, both large financial services firms, who had been in conversation with Veyron about major contract renewals, went quiet in a way that was not technically a refusal, but functioned as one. Ryan knew what was happening. Doubt is contagious in business. When a company's leadership is under public scrutiny, the people who depend on that company start asking questions they would not have asked before, and those questions create friction, and friction creates delays, and delays are expensive in ways that show up on the balance sheet before they show up anywhere else. He kept working. That was what he did when things were difficult. He did not strategize about his public image. He did not hire someone to manage the narrative he worked. He was in the office before most of his staff arrived, and he was there when most of them left, and the work he did in that period was the kind that is invisible until it isn't shoring up client relationships. One conversation at a time, tightening the operational structure, preparing the European expansion that had been in planning for 2 years, and that he had no intention of delaying, regardless of what the financial press thought about his judgment. It was during this period that he also began building the team that would eventually lead the European operation. One of the people he hired in those months was Patricia Holt, a former director at a London-based data firm who had reached out through a recruiter and who in the span of a single interview demonstrated the specific quality Ryan valued most. In the people around him, she did not require managing. She asked harder questions than he expected, pushed back on 2 assumptions in his European market analysis, and was right on both counts. He offered her the role of head of European operations before she left the building. She accepted without negotiating the title, only the scope of her authority. Ryan respected that immediately. Evelyn Hart reached out on a Wednesday afternoon in early May, roughly 6 weeks after the acquisition story broke. Her message came through a mutual contact, a brief note saying she had been following Veyron for some time and would like to speak with Ryan directly if he was open to it. Ryan had heard the name. Hart Capital was not a firm that made headlines because it was deliberately structured not to. Evelyn had built it over 15 years by doing the thing that most investors claim to do, and few actually manage, betting on people rather than optics, and being right often enough that her track record was its own advertisement. They met for coffee at a place she suggested nothing formal, a small spot in the West Village that was not the kind of venue designed to impress anyone. Evelyn arrived exactly on time, ordered an espresso, and did not make small talk. Ryan appreciated that immediately. She did not ask him where he had gone to school. She did not ask about his background or his path, or the years before Veyron, all the details that the Whitmore family had treated as a ledger of insufficiency. What she asked about was the European market, specifically what Ryan saw there, that the people who were skeptical of the expansion were missing. She asked about the decision-making architecture inside Veyron, how authority was distributed, how Ryan handled disagreement at the senior level, what he did when the data and his instincts pointed in different directions. She asked what he thought Veyron would look like in 7 years, and the way she asked it made clear she was not looking for an elevator pitch. She was looking for whether he had actually thought about it, Ryan told her. Not the version he gave to shareholders, careful and reassuring. The real version where he thought the market was moving, what he believed Veyron could do at scale, that its competitors were structurally unable to replicate, what the expansion into Europe was actually about, and why the timing, despite appearances, was correct. He talked for a while. Evelyn listened the way sharp people listen, not waiting for a pause to respond, but actually taking it in. When he finished, she set down her espresso cup and told him what she was thinking. Hart Capital was prepared to invest. The valuation she was working from was considerably lower than $10 billion. She named a figure, and Ryan registered it without reacting. But the terms she said were straightforward. She would not ask for operational control. She would not ask for board seats beyond a single observer position. She would not require Ryan to accept a co-CEO or a management partner or any other mechanism by which the people providing the capital would gradually acquire the authority of the person who built the company. She was investing in Veyron. That meant she was investing in the way Ryan ran it. Ryan looked at her for a moment. He asked why, given the current press climate, she was moving toward this rather than away from it. Evelyn said that the press climate was exactly why. The market was treating the Whitmore rejection as evidence of instability. She read it as evidence of clarity, a founder who understood the difference between capital and control and was willing to pay a significant price to maintain that distinction, was a founder who would make that same distinction correctly in every subsequent decision. That was, in her experience, rare enough to be worth investing in. Ryan sat with that for a moment, something shifting in the way he understood the past several months. He had been operating in the frame the market had given him, the frame in which he had turned down a number too large to turn down, and the consequences were the proof of the mistake. Evelyn was offering a different frame, not as consolation, but as analysis. The decision had been correct. The cost was real and temporary. Those two things were not in contradiction. He told her he would review the terms, and they would talk again. She said that was fine. They finished their coffee and parted on the street outside, and Ryan walked back toward the subway with the feeling of a man who has been given not a solution, but the right way to think about a problem. He signed with Evelyn Hart 6 weeks later in mid-June. The announcement was quiet, a brief press release, no fanfare, the kind of funding news that gets noted rather than celebrated. A few publications ran pieces, questioning whether the valuation reflected a come-down for Veyron, and Ryan did not respond to any of them. He had already decided that the period of explaining himself to people with no stake in getting it right was over, but choosing to continue was not the same as finding it easy. The European expansion moved forward on schedule, which was the correct decision, and also a difficult one. The operational demands of standing up new offices in 2 markets simultaneously, while managing ongoing domestic contracts, created a cash flow situation that required careful constant management, the kind where the margin between fine and not fine is real but narrow, and the people responsible for maintaining it do not sleep well. Ryan hired to fill the gaps left by the departed vice presidents, promoted internally, where he could, and absorbed a significant amount of the operational weight himself in the months when the structure was not yet stable enough to carry it without him. Competitors moved quickly to exploit the perception of vulnerability. 2 firms that had been positioning themselves as alternatives to Veyron for years suddenly had much better stories to tell prospective clients, and they told them. Ryan lost one contract he had been certain of, a large logistics company that had been in serious conversation with Veyron for months, and ultimately went with a competitor, citing in their final communication concerns about organizational continuity. He read the phrase twice and set the message down and went back to work. There were days in that period when he thought about the thing Gerald Whitmore had asked him in the conference room, whether he understood what he had walked away from. The number had been clear enough. The terms had been clear enough. What Ryan had been less prepared for was the specific texture of the aftermath. Not the press, not the shareholders, not even the lost contract, but the quieter, more persistent thing, which was the doubt that accumulates when you are paying a cost you chose, and the payment keeps coming, and you cannot yet see what it was for. He did not share this with anyone. It was not the kind of thing he knew how to share, and he was not sure what sharing it would accomplish. He ran the company. He made the decisions. He trusted what he had seen clearly enough at 2 in the morning in his apartment, with the Manhattan light coming through the windows, to walk away from $10 billion. He had not stopped trusting it. But there is a difference between trusting a decision and not feeling the weight of it, and Ryan was carrying the weight. The breaking point came in November, roughly 8 months after the Whitmore meeting. 3 major contracts, all enterprise level, all in the domestic market, entered a period of simultaneous renegotiation. Under normal circumstances, this would have been manageable. Contract renegotiations were a standard part of the business cycle. But the circumstances were not normal. The European offices were in their most cash-intensive phase. 2 of the 3 renegotiating clients had flagged concerns that were partly about contract terms, and partly, Ryan understood, about whether Veyron was the stable long-term partner it had been before the acquisition collapse made everyone uncertain. If all 3 negotiations went badly, the financial pressure would not kill the company, but it would force a restructuring serious enough that the outcome of that restructuring was not something Ryan could fully predict. He stayed late in the office the night he finished reading the latest round of client communications, long after the floor had emptied out. The city outside the windows was doing what it always did, lit, and moving unaware of and uninterested in the particular gravity of any single moment, inside any single building, Ryan sat at his desk, with the lights low and the papers in front of him, and did the thing he had avoided doing for 8 months, which was let himself sit with the full weight of where he was. He thought about the conference room on the 42nd floor. He thought about Gerald Whitmore asking if he understood what he was walking away from. He thought about his own answer, and about whether the certainty he had felt in that moment had been genuine clarity or something harder to admit to the pride of a man who had spent his whole career proving something to a world that had not asked him to, and who had let that old, unfinished argument make a $10 billion decision for him. He stayed with that question. He did not push it away or answer it too quickly. He let it be what it was, which was real and serious, and not the kind of thing that resolves itself by morning. And then, because he was Ryan Cole, and because this was what he did, he picked up the papers and started reading them again. Not to escape the doubt, not because the doubt had resolved, but because the work was still there, and it still needed to be done, and he was still the person responsible for it. The answer to that question, whatever verdict history would eventually deliver on the decision he had made, existed somewhere in the future. The only way to reach it was to keep moving. He turned the page. The city outside continued without him. The 3 contract negotiations ran through December and into January, and Ryan worked them the way he worked everything directly without theater. One conversation at a time. He flew to Chicago for the first client, a logistics company that had been with Veyron since the early years. He did not send a representative or schedule a call. He went himself, sat across the table from their chief operating officer, and spent 2 hours going through the numbers in the kind of granular detail that demonstrates something a prepared presentation cannot, that the person across from you understands the work well enough not to need one. The contract was renewed. The terms were better than the previous cycle. The chief operating officer shook Ryan's hand at the end and said without elaboration that he appreciated Ryan making the trip personally. Ryan said it was worth making. The second negotiation was harder. The client, a financial services firm that had been quietly testing a competitor's platform for several months, came to the table with a set of concerns that were partly about pricing, and partly Ryan could tell about the accumulated uncertainty of the past year. He did not try to argue them out of their concerns. He acknowledged the turbulence, directly named what had happened, without softening it, and then walked them through exactly what Veyron had done in the past 8 months to strengthen the operational infrastructure despite the disruption. He gave them access to internal performance data they had not requested. Transparency in that room accomplished what reassurance could not. They stayed. The third negotiation went badly, and then unexpectedly resolved. The client came in prepared to terminate with a competing offer already in hand. Ryan let them present it in full, asked a handful of questions about what specifically the competitor was offering that Veyron was not, and then responded to each point specifically, not defensively specifically. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, the client asked for 2 weeks to reconsider. 2 weeks later, they signed. Ryan found out afterward that the competing offer had not actually been as strong as it had been presented. The client had been using it as leverage. He did not find this irritating. It was a reasonable thing to do. 3 contracts, all 3 held. The cash flow situation stabilized in February. The European expansion began producing returns in March, earlier than the most optimistic internal projections had anticipated. The first major contract came from a financial data firm in Frankfurt, a company that had been evaluating partners for 14 months and had, according to the account manager who handled the relationship, been close to choosing a London-based competitor before Veyron's proposal moved them. 2 more contracts followed within 6 weeks, one in Amsterdam, one in Zurich, both enterprise level, both the kind of sustained relationships that change a company's revenue profile, not just for a quarter, but structurally for years. Ryan was in London when the Zurich contract was confirmed. He got the call from Patricia Holt, who had been running the European operation from the ground up since the previous spring, and who delivered the news with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything. He thanked her, ended the call, and sat for a moment in the hotel room with the London rain against the windows. He did not feel triumphant. He felt something quieter and more durable, the particular satisfaction of a thing going the way it was supposed to go because the work behind it had been done correctly. The financial press noticed the European numbers first, then the analysts. Then the larger story began to reassemble itself in public, the way stories do when the facts shift enough that the original narrative becomes unsustainable. A publication that had run one of the more pointed columns about Ryan's judgment in the months after the Whitmore rejection now ran a piece about Veyron's European performance under the headline that named Ryan as the founder who had turned down $10 billion and built something larger. The column treated this as though it had always been obvious, as though the earlier coverage had not existed, and Ryan read it once and did not clip it or send it to anyone. By summer, Veyron's valuation had been revised upward in multiple independent assessments. By fall, a full year and a half after Ryan had walked out of that conference room on the 42nd floor, the figure being cited consistently was $28 billion. Nearly 3 times what Gerald Whitmore had placed on the table. The number appeared in financial publications and industry briefings, in the kind of casual references that mean a company has moved from interesting to significant. Ryan noted it the way he noted most external assessments, as information, not as validation. The work had not changed. The measure of it had. The call from the Whitmore family came through Douglas Fitch again, which was either a matter of habit or an acknowledgement that some distances are not easily closed. Fitch's message was professional and brief. The family had been following Veyron's growth with considerable interest and believed there were areas of mutual opportunity worth exploring. They would welcome a conversation at Ryan's convenience. Ryan read the message twice. He thought about Gerald Whitmore at the head of the table delivering $10 billion with the calm of a man who has never had a reason to doubt that what he is offering will be accepted. He thought about Marcus referencing customer support in New Jersey in a tone that was technically polite and actually contemptuous. He thought about the word remarkable and the specific weight it had carried, and about the phrase unconventional path, and about all the small, consistent signals across 5 weeks of meetings that had amounted to a single clear message: you are useful to us, but you are not our equal, and the money we are offering is, among other things, compensation for the indignity of being reminded of that. He thought about all of it for less time than he expected to. He wrote back to Fitch that he appreciated the outreach, but Veyron was not pursuing new strategic partnerships at this time. He wished them well. He sent the message and closed the window and moved on to the next item in his day. There was no ceremony in it, and no satisfaction. Not the cold kind that comes from watching someone who dismissed you return to ask for your help. He was not interested in that. The Whitmore family had made a calculation about who Ryan Cole was and what he was worth, and they had been wrong, and now they were adjusting. That was their business. Ryan's business was elsewhere. He did not tell anyone about the outreach. It was not a story he needed to tell. Evelyn Hart called on a Thursday afternoon, a social call, the kind she made occasionally, now that they had established a working relationship built on the particular mutual respect that develops between people who have been honest with each other under difficult circumstances. She had seen the latest valuation figures. She said she was glad the European numbers had come in when they did. Ryan said he was too. She said something about the Whitmore story having come full circle, and Ryan said he did not think of it that way, that implying a circle suggested a return to where things started, and nothing had returned. Everything had moved forward. Evelyn considered this and said he was probably right. They talked for a few more minutes about the next phase of expansion and ended the call the way they always did, without anything extraneous. Ryan set the phone down and looked at his desk. It was a Thursday in October, and outside the Manhattan light was doing what October light does in New York, lower and more angled than summer, cutting across the buildings in a way that makes the city look briefly like something that exists in 3 dimensions, rather than the flat surface it presents for most of the year. He had work to finish. He got back to it. The evening he would remember longest from that period was not the day the $28 billion valuation was confirmed, or the day the 3rd European contract was signed, or the day Fitch's message arrived and was answered and set aside. It was a Friday evening in November, more than a year after that night in the office, when he had sat alone with the papers and let himself confront the full weight of where he was. He had stayed late without particular reason finishing a report that could have waited until Monday, but that he preferred to complete while the details were still clear in his mind. The office was empty. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was doing what Manhattan does on a Friday night in November, bright and restless, moving with the specific energy of a place that does not believe in stillness. Ryan stood at the glass for a moment before gathering his things, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing. He thought briefly about where this had all started. The rented office above the laundromat in Brooklyn, the folding table, the legal pad, the particular quality of quiet, in a room where a person is committed to something they cannot yet fully see. He had been 31 then. He did not have money or connections or a name that opened doors in the rooms where decisions got made. He had a problem he understood, and a conviction that he was the right person to solve it, and he had built everything that followed out of those 2 things, piece by piece, decision by decision, over years. He thought about the conference room on the 42nd floor, about Gerald Whitmore's question and his own answer, and about what it had cost him to mean it, not abstractly but specifically in the months of press coverage and shareholder anxiety and contract uncertainty and doubt that had followed. He had paid that cost. He had paid it without knowing the outcome, which is the only way the kind of decision he made is ever actually made. A person cannot know the ending when they are standing at the point where the decision matters. They only know what they are willing to keep. He had been willing to keep this, the company he had built, the authority to run it according to his judgment, the ability to look at his own decisions without having to first check whether they were acceptable to people who had made clear in 5 weeks of polite meetings that they considered him a useful instrument rather than a person of equivalent standing. $28 billion. The number existed. It was real, and it mattered, and Ryan was not the kind of person who pretended that money is irrelevant when it is not. But the number had not been what was at stake in that conference room, and he had known it then, standing at the elevator watching the floor numbers descend. What had been at stake was something harder to name and easier to lose the particular kind of self-possession that a person builds across a lifetime of doing things on their own terms, and that can be traded away in a single moment for something that looks like security but functions as a different kind of loss. He had not traded it. He had walked out of the building into the morning, and the city had received him without ceremony, and he had gone back to work. The glass was cold against the night air outside. Ryan stood at it a moment longer. Below him, Manhattan continued in all directions, indifferent and luminous as it had always been. He turned away from the window and picked up his coat and walked toward the elevator. He had an early morning. He always had an early morning. The thing about the decision Ryan Cole made in that conference room was that it was not in the end about money. It was not even about the Whitmore family, or about Gerald's careful condescension, or about the word remarkable carrying more weight than it was meant to. Those were the specific circumstances. They were not the point. The point was simpler than any of that, and it applied to anyone who had ever been offered something large enough to make them consider becoming smaller in exchange for it. Not every opportunity that arrives in the shape of a door is actually a door. Some of them are ceilings, and the only way to know which is to understand clearly what you are being asked to give up before you step through. Ryan had understood. He had walked away from $10 billion and built $28 billion in its place, which made for a clean story, and which the financial press enjoyed enormously. But the part of the story that mattered was not the number at the end. It was the fact that when he got there, when the European contracts were signed and the valuation was confirmed, and the city was visible through the windows of an office that was entirely his to run, he arrived as himself. Not a smaller version, not a managed version, not the version that had been deemed acceptable by people who thought his path gave them the right to define his ceiling. He arrived as the person who had built the thing, and that in the end was what no number had ever been large enough to purchase.